Good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another webinar from the New Lines Institute. My name is Emily Prey. I'm a senior analyst for special initiatives here at New Lines, and I'm looking forward to moderating this panel today. Today's event is brought to you by New Lines Gender Policy Project. And as a part of our webinar series, I am delighted to be speaking with Akila Radhakrishnan, Kimberly Anez Mcguire, and Latanya Mapp-Fret to discuss the new White House Gender Policy Council. This council will ensure that policy areas traditionally viewed as women's issues like sexual harassment, childcare, and reproductive health won't be separated from the administration's broader priorities anymore, like economic recovery, climate change, and infrastructure. It sends a clear message to the rest of government that gender equity and gender equality are top priorities that will be integrated throughout all government agencies. There have been councils dedicated to women in the past. The Obama administration had the Council on Women and Girls, and the Clinton administration had the Interagency Council on Women. But the Gender Policy Council is the first one that will report directly to the president. And this is a big deal. The Gender Policy Council will also have full-time staff, and every cabinet member will participate. Whether this is a formality or not, it shows that agency leaders are obligated to make clear commitments to advance the rights of people of all genders, notably women. Cabinet members will also have to designate representatives within their agencies who will be in charge of advancing gender equity work, both within their teams and when it comes to drafting new policies. The creation of this council is a critical first step to uplifting the rights of women and girls in the US and around the world. But there's still much more work to be done. Today, I'm joined by three brilliant women to discuss that work and what issues the council should prioritize and why. Joining us as panelists, we have Akila Radhakrishnan, who's the president of the Global Justice Center. She directs GJC's strategies and efforts to establish legal precedents protecting human rights and ensuring gender equality. Akila has authored numerous shadow reports, legal briefs, and advocacy documents, and provided legal expertise to domestic and international stakeholders and policymakers, including the ICC, the UN, the EU, and state governments. Prior to the Global Justice Center, she worked at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, DPK Consulting, and Drinker, Biddle, and Reith LLP. Latanya Mapp-Fret is the president and CEO of Global Fund for Women, which works to strengthen gender justice movements, to shift power, privilege, and perception, and create meaningful change that will last beyond our lifetimes. Previously, Latanya was the executive director of Planned Parenthood Global. She worked for 8 years as a human rights officer for UNICEF and for 10 years with USAID. Last, but certainly not least on this panel of experts, we have Kimberly Anez Mcguire, who is the executive director of URGE, Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, where she leads the organization in building a world where all people have agency over their own bodies and relationships and the power, knowledge, and tools to exercise that agency. Previously, Kimberly served as a senior program director with Conway Strategic and as director of public affairs for the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. She serves on the board of directors for the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States. Thank you all so much for joining me. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. I'm excited to get this conversation going. Each speaker will have 10 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will open up for question and answer. I'd like to encourage the audience to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the comment section on YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter at NewLinesINST or subscribe to our YouTube channel. So I would like to start off with a quick question for everyone, which you can get to in your opening remarks, just kind of explaining why gender is so important to foreign and domestic affairs and security, and how having a gendered lens when looking at foreign and domestic policy issues illuminate connections among individuals, institutions, economies, and states, and why this is important. So I'll let Latanya answer first, and then we'll move to Kimberly and then to Akila. So Latanya, the floor is yours.
Okay, sorry, I had to get myself off of mute. Thank you, Emily, for that introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be with Akila and Kimberly on this panel. And I suspect I am among us, very excited about the new administration. It is, having done 10, actually 12 years in government as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, such a pleasure to be able to see some of the appointments that are coming. I mean, the council is one thing, and I'll get to that, but it is, only as good as the people that are on these, mechanisms that we can celebrate. I think right now that there is an enormous amount of political appointees that can now, I think, after 4 years of really beating up our colleagues in civil service, they can now be joined by political appointees that are really going to move issues. Many of these people have experience in government, and they know how to actually attend to the implementation and what needs to get done. So I wanted to start there because I do think it's incredibly important, not just the council, but the environment that the council is around. And so you mentioned I'm with Global Fund for Women right now. And so I've been almost 2 years with this organization. And so I live, breathe, and sleep, gender issues, and in particular, gender justice movements and how we can advance gender equality around the world. Primarily, our work is done outside of the United States. And so we think, primarily about shifting power from the global north. These terms, we'll fix them later, but from the global north to the global south. And so when we're talking about supporting communities around the world, we have to really be serious about how we include them in the conversation about what is the kind of support that they need. And I know that this is, sort of, ABCs of how you do international development anymore, but I think it's been missing in the last few years. And so we start by centering women, centering women's movements in their organizations, and empowering them to be able to do the work that is required. And when you think about the pandemic that we're in, it's so crucially important that we make sure movements have what they need in order to take care of their communities, to change the systemic barriers that they're commonly placed in front of them, and then achieve a system of success that really comes from their own interpretation and translation of what that looks like, and not someone else's. And so when I think about where we are in Washington, again, I'm excited, but I do want us to not just fix what happened the last 4 years, but I want us, in the vein of the president, himself, do better, build back better. And I think we have that opportunity. I think we need bold feminists in office, and I think we have some of those who are going to be able to center the issues around the most marginalized and allow us all to thrive. And so there's a couple of things I'll point out that have happened already, and I think that they're good signs that we're going in the right direction. And so the global gag rule was appealed, and at Global Fund for Women, we've been very, very, as well as other organizations, concerned about the global gag rule and its impact. I've lived through that impact in many iterations of my past. And so I know how important it was to repeal it, but we have to go further than that. We're going to have to really make sure that the funding, around gender justice issues includes racial justice, disability justice, climate justice, sexual rights, because they're all intersectionally related. In these inequalities together, women have to address from a certain perspective that I think if we just deal with one thing, we're not going to get at it. But if we deal with all of these things together, then we'll be able to do that. And I know there's a bill in Congress that the HER policy, and I don't know if Akila will talk about that more, but we can come back to it. So in addition to the Gender Council, I think that is, we have to make sure that we're not creating laws that actually place further barriers in front of women as we try to get back to fixing what has been broken for so many years. I also just want to say generally, having Linda Thomas Greenfield at the United Nations is going to be hugely important in trying to get us back on the right path. When we talk about global policies and how they impact our global community, it means you need a feminist at the UN, and I believe that that's what's going to happen. I think Samantha Power at the helm of USAID, when we talk about foreign assistance and how we fund local groups and local movements to do the work of their communities, I think then we're also in the right place. And so these things make me very excited. I heard the Vice President Harris talk about the urgency of women leaving the workforce. I know we have got to get our heads around that, both domestically, but also internationally, because this is a problem that we've seen for this last year is going to it has the possibility to set us back. And so I see that as a very good move for why it's important that we deal with gender justice issues. There's also a couple of other things. Our colleagues at Me Too is asking the Gender Council to name sexual violence as a public health crisis. I think that's urgently important, again, both domestic and international. I know Dr. Julia Crea Perry at the National Birth Equity Collaborative, we've joined her in advocating for a White House office on sexual and reproductive health and well-being. We've seen how this issue has been politicized so much over the last couple of decades that, you know, in order to make it better, to apply this anti-racist, anti-sexist lens in government, that this is going to be important. So I'll just end with, you know, the White House Council is hugely important. I see it also as an opportunity to see male allies in government really step up and talk about these issues, fix these issues, and to, I think, you know, in my opinion, become a lever for where activists and organizations and advocates can really have a voice where it hadn't been before in government. So I'll end there and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Latanya. If Kimberly will hear your opening remarks next.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much to my co-panelists. I'm really excited about this conversation today. When we think about all of the major issues that people in this country care about, whether it's healthcare, whether it's criminalization of Black and Brown communities, environmental issues, climate, racial justice, and economic justice, we cannot fully understand, much less take action on any of these issues if we are not starting from a gender justice lens. When we reflect on the lessons of Black feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the phrase intersectionality, to help us understand that to be experiencing both racial and gendered oppression, or oppression as both a woman and a person with a disability, or as a trans person and a Black person, to live in these bodies and these identities at the same time means that we experience environmental policies differently. We experience economic policies differently. And so I'm very excited to see a new and focused commitment around gender justice, and very hopeful that that commitment does include, as I think we've seen some good signals, but we're of course going to be holding the council to account on this, that yes, it's a gender justice lens, but it has to be gender and race and economics, and really recognizing the multiplicity of identities and frankly oppressions that so many people in our community are experiencing. When we look at some of the sort of current policy struggles that we're dealing with as a country, you know, I think about what's happening in Texas right now, where you have, you know, a state where every single county has been impacted by massive climate disaster, lack of investment in people of color. You know, there is very little conversation about how the Texas power and water disaster is impacting women. And yet there is no question that when we look at, you know, the working moms who've already had their lives turned upside down by the pandemic, when we look at, you know, underemployed immigrant women or immigrant women in Texas who are employed in, you know, marginalized workforces, these are the populations who, when disaster strikes, are on the front lines and first to be harmed. And so there's so many ways in which, if we want to advance justice for the entire country, if we want to not only, heal the incredible harms of the Trump administration and undo, all of the terrible things that have happened for the last 4 years, but we actually need to do better than that, right? We need to go beyond the pre-Trump status quo. And the only way that we are going to get there is with a focus and a prioritization of a gendered lens. In terms of, what we're hopeful that the council might do, and I should say, so, my organization, URGE, we're a young people's reproductive justice organization. And in particular, most of our work is focused in the South and the Midwest. And so the very communities that we are organizing and working with are the same communities that are really living and unfortunately sometimes not surviving at the intersections of gender-based oppression, of racism, of economic injustice. And the stories that we hear and the lessons that we learn from these communities tell us that there is so much leadership needed right now from the White House on some of these critical issues. And there's 3 specific things that I want to name that I think we're really hopeful the administration can work towards. So the first is, there is so much power in what a president says or doesn't say. I mean, we need only think about, administrations that were either silent or not silent around the HIV/AIDS crisis to understand that, saying the words matters, right? And so we think about something like abortion stigma, where, a healthcare service that 1 in 4 women will access in this country is not even really talked about by so many of our leaders. It's just unacceptable. We know that we can do better. And so we are hopeful that that this council will, recognize the connection between, frankly, stigma and public health, right? That we can't actually ensure access to healthcare if we can't even say the words out loud, right? And so we're hopeful that this council can frankly broker honest conversations about the full range of gender justice issues, including sexual and reproductive health. Secondly, there is a lot that can be done at a federal level to expand access to necessary sexual and reproductive health care. There are a number of pieces of legislation that, we've been very excited to introduce again and again, knowing that there was no one who was going to sign it at the finish line. Things have changed a little bit there. There's a lot we can do with the HHS. There's several levers that the Biden administration could use to immediately or, in the short term, expand access to necessary sexual and reproductive health information and services. And because we know that that most of the country is not in Washington, D.C., we know that, federal policy only reaches so far, and yet we know the power of leading by example. When I think about the harmful example that the Trump administration played for 4 years in really sending a message to state legislatures to go on full attack, whether it's on women's access to health care, whether it's on abortion care, whether it's on trans communities, not all of that originated, of course, from the Trump administration, but that signal was there, right? Like, these are the communities that you can go after. And so similarly, but hopefully for good and not for harm, the Biden administration has a real opportunity to lead by example and send a clear message to policymakers around the country that women are not disposable. Trans people are not disposable. Women of color, immigrant women, should not and will not be attacked and marginalized on their watch. And so, I think really the sky's the limit in terms of real leadership opportunities with this administration. Also, I'm real clear that there are a lot of folks standing in line outside that White House with their proposals and their needs and their wants and their ideas. And we have got to make sure that gender justice, in particular, the needs of trans and non-binary people and the needs of women of color, are at the front of that line and at the top of the priority list.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Very strong opening remarks. And we will finish it off with Akila.
Hi, thanks so much, everyone, for having me. As Emily mentioned, I'm the president of the Global Justice Center. We're an international human rights organization focused on advancing gender equality through the rule of law. So kind of to piggyback on Latanya and Kimberly, I'm really going to focus some of my remarks on key issues of foreign policy, and in some places, key issues where we don't often think about gender, because I think that is the space that this council also has the policy to address, because it's not, I'm certainly going to talk about reproductive rights, but I'm also going to talk about what's going on right now in Myanmar, where you have a coup and you have women at the center of movement to address what a militarized government looks like. And I think that, to me, that's the hope of having a gender policy council, is that it's something that aims and tries to bring these gendered considerations that Latanya and Kimberly have mentioned to every level of domestic and foreign policy decision making, and seeks to bring these experiences to the spaces where we often disregard women's experiences, the experiences of marginalized communities, for geopolitical reasons, for issues of national security, right? We can see a good focus on gender when it comes to the areas that feel palatable and easy. But the minute something more important is the primary consideration, women get thrown out the table. So that's really, I think, what I want to talk about. And I think really, Latanya alluded to this, the time could not be more prescient, not just because of the systematic attacks that the Trump administration levied, but what COVID has really revealed, which is the deep and systemic inequalities around the world and the disproportionate impacts that a pandemic or crises or conflict have on marginalized and at-risk communities, including women and girls, including trans individuals. This is what we need to be grappling with. Just yesterday, the UN Secretary General was addressing the Human Rights Council, and he said, in a matter of months, progress on gender equality has been set back decades. That is what we're grappling with here. And I think that is the challenge that is now put to something like the Gender Policy Council, is to really say, how are we going to grapple with not just these surface issues, but the systematic problems, the entrenched issues that are at the core of why these things were allowed to happen in the first place. Because it's, the fact that massive amounts of women have left the workplace is not the result of 1 year of a pandemic. It's a result of a system that never fully grappled with what it means that women share the burden of, or women don't share the burden, women bear the burden of unpaid care work in their lives, in their home lives. And so that's really what we need to grapple with, is what's underneath all of this. And so for us, I was trying to think about how to frame what we're looking for out of this. And I think we're looking for three things here. So first, and I think this has really come through from Kimberly and Latanya's, the council needs to be feminist. They need to be intersectional, inclusive, anti-racist, and anti-colonial. We're really looking for that type of approach here. The same old approach that focuses on traditional women's issues, that is not enough. Second, the council needs to not shy away from the so-called difficult or controversial issues such as abortion. And third, they need to be bold, comprehensive, and unequivocal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those here. So I think first, in terms of thinking about what it means for the council to be feminist, intersectional, anti-racist, anti-colonial, in the context of foreign policy, I've really been thinking about what this approach means in the context of something like Myanmar. So just a brief background. A couple of weeks ago on February 1st, the military in Myanmar staged a coup where they arrested the civilian leadership of the country, including Aung San Suu Kyi, and they instituted and put themselves in power. The country has risen up in massive protests amongst this, and you'll see that women are at the center of this movement. This is the same military that for decades has committed genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, including through systematic campaigns of sexual violence against ethnic groups in the country. What we're grappling with here is we've seen, so the Biden administration has come out strongly. They've condemned the coup and they've issued some targeted sanctions, but they don't actually go to what is being called for by those on the ground, including the ethnic communities. And this is a pattern that we've seen in the US's engagement in Myanmar. So the Obama administration actually considers the democratic transition in Myanmar as one of its major foreign policy successes, right? That was one of the lynch pieces. It's in Hillary Clinton's book. It's something that they talked about, is ushering that in. Well, in a matter of weeks, all of that has been undone. And that's because democratic transition was never really happening in the first place, because the military was in power the entire time, because there was entrenched impunity for the crimes that they systematically committed against ethnic communities, and whose voice was always ignored in making these foreign policy considerations. It was that of ethnic women. Ethnic women have consistently said over the last 15 years through the entire transition that this democratic transition hasn't meant much for them, that the military has never been out of power, that their lives have not changed, that none of this is real and certain. And here's where we're at now. And so as I think about what it means for the US to think about what their next steps are in addressing this coup. So, yes, the targeted sanctions are a good starting point. They need to be centering the experiences and the voices of these marginalized communities who were the voices that were warning about this from the start. They were the ones who were ignored for those geopolitical considerations that I was talking about before, because the US and the rest of the international community, what they wanted to see was progress. They wanted to see a democratic transition be a success. And they did that at the expense of ignoring the warning signs that were coming from those who were being affected by the lack of change. And that's the story, whether that's here in the United States or around the world. That's the story, is we don't heed the voices of those who are marginalized, who say that these policies that you're touting and that you're talking about, they don't actually take into consideration our experiences. They don't actually meet our needs. And so to me, when it comes to something like a coup in Myanmar, which is something we wouldn't normally think about as being within the ambit of a gender policy council, to me, that's exactly the role that the Gender Policy Council should be playing. It should be making sure that women are at the center of the response that the US is designing, that the US is using its power to put women in positions of power in, conversations about conflict resolution and what the next steps for the country should look like. And similarly, I think what's really important, and Kimberly talked about this, is the council can't shy away from controversial issues. I'm putting abortion as a controversial issues in quotes because I don't actually think it's all that controversial. But Kimberly said it. The administration hasn't said the word abortion. They've issued multiple statements. They issued a statement on Roe v. Wade Day, and they didn't even say the word abortion once. Even in repealing the global gag rule, which was something we were all looking forward to, that memorandum only used the word abortion when it was quoting the legislative language of the Helms Amendment and of Title 10. What's happening here is you're seeing a marginalization, and this is one that's normal, is somehow it's possible to deal with sexual and reproductive rights, that it's possible to deal with gender equality, but you just kind of put abortion over here. While the Biden administration repealed the global gag rule, they've made no statements or no commitments around the Helms and Hyde amendments, which have been the call, by the way, of women of color in the United States, of the communities around the world, to say that the gag rule is one small part of this picture. And with the Helms and Hyde amendments in place, marginalized communities are still not going to be able to get access to abortion. And we just, frankly, we've seen the Biden administration take good, strong stances on certain issues. They've said good things on white supremacy, around LGBTQI rights. They issued an executive order on LGBTQI rights, and it's wonderful and it's the right thing to do. But somehow, when it comes to abortion, they are still shirking away from it. You see the press secretary, who's been fantastic in answering questions, but every time she's asked for a question on abortion, she waffles the answer. And the answer is something absolutely around, the first time I think it was around Biden's Catholic faith, and didn't answer a question on the Hyde Amendment and instead said something about him being Catholic. And I think that it's time that, if we're going to say that gender is going to guide the work of this administration, they have to make sure that things like abortion are not stigmatized and that they're actually head on dealing with the harm that's caused when we choose to ignore issues that are not convenient or palatable to others. And finally, I just want to say that I think we need to think a lot about what it means for this work to be comprehensive. One thing that, I think all countries do this, is they'll do and say one thing with one hand, and on the other hand, they're undermining exactly what they're saying they stand for, right? So what does it mean when the US says it stands for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, when it uses policies like the Helms Amendment to deny them the services that they need? What does it mean when the US says that they stand for justice for sexual and gender-based violence, when the institutions like the International Criminal Court that can bring forward justice for these crimes are undermined and attacked by the US when they do something that attacks the US's own interests, right? So just 3 weeks ago, one day apart, the US both welcomed a decision from the International Criminal Court on the Ongwen case, which related to the Lord's Resistance Army and sexual and gender-based violence had been committed by them, and the next day forcefully attacked the court because it issued a ruling saying that the court had jurisdiction over Palestine. And because that was something that, that both comes across as holding Israel accountable, which the US can't stand for from many reasons. And it also implicates other considerations that are going on at the court around holding the US accountable for its own acts in Afghanistan. And so I think we have to think about all of these considerations in a line here, because we need to call the U out when it says that it's a champion for these things, when those actions that it takes in other arenas are actually undermining everything that they say that they stand for. So I think I'll stop here, because I think that's really what we're looking for is this more systematic approach to gender across all of the areas.
Thank you so much, Akila. Very comprehensive. And I think that after these opening remarks, our audience will have a better idea of what the Gender Policy Council is about and hopefully what it can do. I wanted to ask LaTanya, since Akila was just speaking about foreign policy issues, can you explain what a feminist foreign policy is? I think there's a lot of confusion around this idea. People don't quite know what it means, or misunderstand the term, or maybe just brush it off because it has the word feminist in it. So can you explain what that is, and then what are some foreign policy issues, feminist foreign policy issues, that the council can prioritize and make sure that Biden is aware of, given his message that America is back when it comes to international diplomacy and working with allies?
No, it's good. And thanks, Kimberly and Akila, for setting this up, because I think the reason that feminist foreign policy is important is because it does get to some of these structural issues. We're never going to be a country, probably even a world, where we all agree on one thing. But I think some of the principles behind a feminist foreign policy helps us determine what the priorities have to be and how we have to address them. And I think that, the way we have traditionally, especially in foreign assistance, from which I have a lot of information, the way we fund other countries, talking about some of the controversial issues that we've talked about, abortion, Palestine, Myanmar. These are things that I think if we had a structural kind of agreement, then it would be easier for us to address these things and easier for us to explain to our constituencies why we address them. So I just preface that because I think it's important when we talk about a feminist foreign policy that we understand why we need this, and we understand how without it, we get to some of these places where we just can't move for our inability to agree on how we move. And I'll just read quickly the startup of what was put together by ICRW with a group of what I'll call them feminist countries, but countries who adhere to, or either at least publicly are unabashed or unafraid to talk about a feminist policy in their country. And it cuts across the foreign policy, of course. Once you say you have a feminist foreign policy, it does actually mean that you have to then stand strong on those issues domestically as well. But a feminist foreign policy is a policy where a state defines its interactions with other states and movements in a manner that prioritizes gender equality and enshrines the human rights of women and other traditionally marginalized groups. Everything we've been talking about here. It allocates significant resources to achieve that vision and seeks through the implementation to disrupt patriarchal and male-dominated power structures across all of its levers and influence. So aid, trade, defense, diplomacy. And it's informed by the voices of feminist activist groups and movements. And so just to quickly talk about what those principles look like, which I think is, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it just seems common sense in some ways, what the goal is here. But we know a number of countries have already announced this. We know Sweden, Canada, France, and Mexico, to name a few, are already trying to practice this and struggling with what it means for their own countries. And I think it just makes sense for the council to try to deal with that here. But we know that, first of all, it means that women's rights are human rights. Our US foreign policy is going to have, it's like, I don't even know why we have to say this 25 years later, but we do. But we have to say that US foreign policy must respect the rights recognized by international institutions and agreements. They can't see themselves as outside. Akila made an incredible point around the criminal court. But we also have to ensure that human rights due diligence when acting jointly with other states, and that's what she was getting at. The U.S. has to position itself on the side of those seeking to defend and promote the rights and freedoms of individuals and groups around the world. And this also means walking the talk at home, of course, and in ratification of some of these documents like CEDAW and CRC and others human rights conventions that we have not yet signed, which hopefully this administration will see as a priority, and the council will put that on the table, put it back on the table, should I say. And then second, that U.S. foreign policy should be representative, inclusive, responsive, and accountable to its stakeholders. So foreign policy has traditionally been informed by patriarchal, racist, discriminatory institutions in this country. And a feminist approach demands that there's gender parity and representation, right? So as well as active commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially with regard to gender race, we have to be in a position to be able to have these issues by the people that are affected. So having women at the table. And I will say, you know, with this administration, we're looking pretty good in who we put out there. So now we just need to give them, and I consider myself an activist and an advocate, we have to give them the energy beneath their wings to be bold and to stop siloing these issues and be intersectional. Because this approach has, the feminist foreign policy takes into account and seeks to address the multiple intersecting forms. And we've talked about this, but these intersecting discriminations that we're seeing that are based on gender, race, age, language, socioeconomic status, they have to be bold enough to try to tackle these things and break them down. And so I have a couple recommendations, but that's sort of the principle, and that's what you were asking, Emily. So I'll pass it over to you, and when you get back to me, I can talk about what I think has to be done.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I had a quick example of feminist foreign policy in actions so that people can kind of get a better idea of what it means on the ground. So for example, the US is the largest exporter of major arms in the world. And then the US also purports to uphold human rights at home and abroad through various treaties and policies. And yet American-made weapons are being used to kill innocent civilians in conflicts around the world. So there's a disconnect here. And a feminist foreign policy would address these connections and create policy objectives that protect innocent people from violence and improve the lives of those specifically impacted by arms violence. An example of one such policy could be reducing arms sales to Saudi Arabia, who is our largest our top buyer. And places like Saudi Arabia could then buy those weapons and use them to bomb and kill innocent civilians in Yemen and displace countless others, and leaving behind a country that has been ravaged by war and malnutrition and disease. And this doesn't really fit with the image that the US wants to project to the world as a champion of human rights. So last month, Biden actually temporarily froze arms sales to Saudi. So we'll see what happens with that. But that's an example of feminist foreign policy. Thank you, LaTanya, for laying out what it is and why it's so important. Hopefully we all understand it a bit better. And I don't know if you want to go into more detail about more issues, or I can pass it to Kimberly for a question.
Yeah, and I just want to, I guess when you say that, it's like, how do we not make these political issues, right? And I think that is what having a feminist foreign policy or having the ability to lean on that does, right? But in general, even if we never sign anything that says that we have a feminist foreign policy, acting in that way is truly important. And there are a lot of countries that try to do that. And I think the US has the ability now with the council reporting directly to the president to be able to boldly, and we keep saying that because it's so important. I think politics gets in the way sometimes when literally the political job of this council is to say these issues, is to deal with and tackle these issues. So I know in front of Congress, I mentioned the Global Her Act is there. So having that is something that we tackle. We've already mentioned Helms and Hyde So getting at and tackling some of these things that have been barriers to gender equity and equality, I think is going to have to be crucially important. So not just dealing with the executive branch, but really trying hard to point out where legislation and even judicial matters have to be in front of this council, in order for us to stop the politics and get at what is important if we want to move ahead. I know there's also the GLOBE Act to help protect LGBTQI human rights worldwide, and remove the anti-prostitution loyalty oath is another one. So there are a bunch of things that, even if we just sort of put the politics aside and just say what is really affecting marginalized communities around the world, I hope that this council feels that that's their place to do that and put it in front. So I'll just stop there. But thank you, Emily, for that example. It's important.
And I just want to pause for a moment for those of you who are just tuning in. I'm speaking to Latanya Mapfret, Akila Radhakrishnan, and Kimberly Anez Mcguire about the new White House Gender Policy Council and what issues it should prioritize. Don't forget to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will hopefully get to those towards the end. So Kimberly, thank you for waiting patiently. You spent your career working on reproductive justice and public policy. And so I think this is an incredibly important consideration for the Gender Policy Council. We've had, everyone has mentioned the Global Gag Rule, the HER Act, the Helms Amendment. Can you go into a bit more detail about what all of this means, and explain why sexual and reproductive rights aren't just a women's issue and why they should be national and international priorities?
Absolutely, Emily. Happy to do so. So I want to give some really specific examples about, what do we mean when we say sexual and reproductive health and rights? What do we mean when we say reproductive justice? And I do want to acknowledge, I know we're not at the Q&A part yet, but I want to acknowledge Mariela's question about, when we say gender justice, when the administration says gender justice, are they really meaningfully including trans and non-binary people? Are they really meaningfully including LGBTQIA+ people, all of whom experience oppression that is rooted in gender injustice? And I just want to be frank, I think the answer is not quite yet, but we can get there, I think, if we can hold this administration accountable. I think it's true that, we're still in a place where most people, including most of our lawmakers, when they hear gender justice, they think women's rights, but these are not the same thing. Gender justice is a much larger umbrella that encompasses the perspectives and the needs of LGBTQIA+ people, in particular, trans and non-binary people. So I think, Mariela, your question is right on and a very important one. So some of the specific issues that we know need urgent action that we're hopeful the council will take a look at. So one is sexuality education. The state of sexuality education in this country is abysmal. Not only do we not have any real sexual and reproductive health education standards in many of our states, we actually have state mandated homophobia, where in states like Alabama, quote unquote sex education teachers have little to no guidance about what they should teach, besides the fact that they have to tell little queer and trans kids that who they are is not okay. So there is so much we can do. We have federal legislation that would absolutely transform this. We're hopeful that the council can take a look at, really making important moves on this issue. We've mentioned access to abortion a few times here, and I just want to take a moment to elaborate a little bit on why we are actually facing a crisis of abortion care in this country right now. So, both of my colleagues have mentioned the Hyde Amendment. So just to remind folks, the Hyde Amendment is a budget policy, not a law, that Congress can pass or not pass every year, that says that if you get your health insurance through Medicaid, if you get your health insurance through a number of other programs, including those for military, Indian Health Service, and a number of other programs, that if that's how you get your health insurance, well, guess what? Too bad, you don't get abortion coverage. And so what this means is, particularly for how the Hyde Amendment impacts Medicaid, is that the most low-income people in this country are completely blocked from getting access to affordable abortion. This is unacceptable. And unfortunately, the Hyde Amendment has been a policy in place longer than I have been alive. Now, we then compound that long-term harm to low-income people by the fact that in the last 10 years, we have seen over 500 new restrictions on abortion at a state level that have proliferated, particularly in an environment where, unfortunately, we have had incredibly hostile state legislatures, incredibly hostile state governors that have allowed this to happen. We now, on top of it all, have a hostile Supreme Court that has already shown their unwillingness to allow for even the most basic access to abortion. And so it is critical that this administration take bold action, say the word abortion. You know, people who have abortion deserve the dignity of recognition. And to recognize that when we talk about Roe v. Wade or the right to abortion, you know, the right to abortion doesn't mean anything if you're poor and can't afford it. The right to abortion doesn't mean anything if you live in a rural area, there's no bus service, and the only clinic is 2 hours away. So we need to be talking about access. And, you know, while the Biden administration, I think we're hopeful because during his campaign, President Biden actually kind of famously reversed course after having opposed lifting restrictions on abortion coverage and ultimately said, you know, actually that he opposes the Hyde Amendment now. Well, it's time for us to hold the administration to account, because while that was said during the campaign, we have not seen the kind of full-throated advocacy that we really need to see from this administration. A few other issues that I want to lift up. There is a crisis as well of attacks on particularly trans young people across this country. We have seen, particularly across the South and the Midwest, a huge trend of state legislation that is attacking young trans people's inclusion in school, in sports, in healthcare. And this is happening in states where, frankly, legislators have very little to offer their constituents, and so they're offering an agenda of hate. And so this administration has got to be very clear in standing on the side of trans and non-binary kids who are currently under the most, really being targeted by state legislatures. And the last piece I want to name, again, which I think the administration, you know, has tremendous potential to take action around, is the way that gender justice and gender-based oppression is showing up in prisons, jails, and detention centers, and in particular, the sterilization abuse and the denial of reproductive health care that is happening in these facilities. And so, you know, there are, again, you know, there's this sort of universe of sexual and reproductive health issues, right? Yes, it's about abortion, but it's also about being able to have children and raise our children in health and in dignity and in safe environments. Yes, it is about sex ed. It's also about making sure that trans and non-binary people are included in every aspect of society. So it's not one issue. It's not just women. You know, these are issues of justice that impact our entire country. And, you know, the last thing I want to say, I want to say a word about accountability. And that is, you know, let's be really clear. The reason that Vice President Kamala Harris can break a tie in the Senate is because young Black people in Georgia came out on January 5th to a runoff election to claim their power and their place in history. And those young Black folks in Georgia and young Black and brown and queer and trans people across this country who voted for this administration voted for an end to racial and gender oppression. And they are watching, and they are not shy and will not be shy in holding this administration accountable, again, not just to roll back the bad things Trump did, but to actually project us forward into the future that our communities deserve, a future where we can all thrive.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was incredibly helpful and definitely something that we all need to think more about and prioritize. And hopefully the council will prioritize sexual and reproductive rights for everyone across the board. My last question before we hopefully have some time to get to audience questions for Akilah. I know that you work a lot on sexual and gender-based violence at the Global Justice Center. Sexual violence can be used as a form of genocide. We've seen that recently in the recent past with the Yazidis and the Rohingya. We're currently seeing it with the Uyghurs in China. It's a crime against humanity. It's used as a form of oppression. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, the world has also been facing what has been called the shadow pandemic of violence against women. So my question is two parts. Number one, what can the Biden administration do through this council to address SGBV around the world and at home? Not only in conflicts, but also in everyday life. And also, how important is it or not that the US sign on to international treaties like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, more easily known as CEDAW, which we haven't signed on to. LaTanya mentioned it earlier, but Biden has signaled that he's willing to do so.
Thanks so much. There's a lot in there. So I think on I'll just briefly say something about SGBV, which is I think that, what the Gender Policy Council can do is there's a lot that can be done from the prevention of atrocities and SGBV down towards our response, and that needs to be a continuum and it needs to be comprehensive. And so I think that, it's incorporating a gendered approach, for example, to the work of the Mass Atrocity Prevention Board, right? And a board that you don't, again, these are topics and issues that you don't generally think about when it comes to gender. It means recognizing very seriously gendered harms as ones that cause us to act. So you mentioned the Uyghurs. A lot that's going on with the Uyghurs has to do with campaigns of forced sterilization of women, right? And now recently experiences in the detention context of systematic sexual violence. So what does it mean when we hear evidence of these things? We don't need to hear an evidence of a mass instance of killing in order for us to be prompted to act. And often these acts of violence against women are key indicators of atrocities to come, and they themselves are at the core of the atrocities that happen. And so I think that we need to be thinking about what that systematic approach looks like. And then I'm going to move to CEDAW because it's my pet topic, and I'm obsessed with the idea of the US ratifying CEDAW. But I want to say I'm obsessed with the idea of the US ratifying CEDAW, not for the reasons that Biden and others have said, which is for women elsewhere, but for women and others, anyone who's impacted by gender in America. Kimberly so powerfully outlined the massive crisis of gender that we're facing here in the United States. It is frankly insulting to me that, and Biden has taken the stance as a senator, by the way, multiple times. He's written an op-ed on CEDAW that I find to be quite offensive. But it's because the stance is everything is fine in the United States. Our laws are fine. We set the standards for what gender equality means. And so when we sign CEDAW, we're doing this for the women of Afghanistan. No, we're not doing this for the women of Afghanistan. We need to do this and take it meaningfully into consideration here. Because if we want to be a global leader on gender equality, we need to start that work here at home. And what does that mean? It means the US shouldn't be one of 7 countries in the world that hasn't signed the International Treaty on Women's Rights, period, right? That's something that we need to consistently be called out about. But second, we need to then take it seriously and implement it, because CEDAW talks about so many things that we don't have here in the United States. CEDAW talks about paid maternity leave, for example, a conversation that it's frankly insane that we don't have here in the United States as a matter of federal policy. That, all we have are bare protections that you can't be fired when you have a child. As the wealthiest nation in the world, it's absolutely crazy. And it's also things that then when we think about CEDAW, we need to think about our approach to CEDAW. So the US really wants to institute what are called reservations, understandings, and declarations when they sign international treaties. They try to limit the scope of what the treaty can mean for a country. So Biden, for example, has advanced in his previous history an understanding that CEDAW is abortion neutral, right? So since we're talking a lot about abortion and the need for sexual and reproductive rights, they say that CEDAW says nothing about abortion. That's not true. CEDAW says plenty about abortion. CEDAW has urged countries to change their abortion laws. It's harmful for the United States to sign a treaty and say that it says something, that the way we read it is to say something that it doesn't actually mean or say. And so I think that, yes, we should ratify CEDAW. We should also ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, because this also goes back to a different problem with the US, where we often stand for human rights when it's for the other, but we don't stand for human rights when it comes to us. We stand for accountability when it comes to somebody else, but we don't stand for accountability when it comes to what we do. And I think that when we sign treaties, our approach has to be that this is for us. And, as a part of this, we are joining this international effort to actually promote the idea that human rights are fundamental to all, that justice is an important pursuit, right? But that has to start here at home. And so I think that, what the Gender Policy Council can do, if they're actually serious about CEDAW, is to actually bring a fresh conversation on CEDAW to the table, because the one that currently exists, and one that has actually been accepted by a lot of women's rights organizations in the United States over the years, is one where CEDAW is really for the other, and the situation is fine here in the United States. And the situation is not fine here in the United States.
Thank you so much, Akila. I think that the view that the U.S. takes on treaties like CEDAW is very much a form of American exceptionalism. That these problems of violence against women, they happen in other places, and we can help them in other places, but we don't really need to address it here because our own laws are so strong that everything is based off of our laws, and we're good to go. And that's simply not the case, as you laid out. So thank you. I want to get to some audience questions while we have time. Ashley Thomas asked, are you aware of any movement to create a domestic feminist economic recovery agenda as has been created in Hawaii, Canada, the UK, and other places? I think particularly now within the context of COVID. I'll open this to the floor and anyone who wants to address this question. Or if you aren't aware of it, what would a feminist economic recovery look like?
And I did mention that I understand, don't have the specifics for us to talk about today, and it might be good for us to weigh in, but I do understand that Vice President Harris has put this at the top of her list of things that she's working on. I referenced it in my opening remarks as women exiting the workforce. And so that has been the sort of the underpinning of what they're trying to do, but they are trying to create a integrated plan around that. And so that is the thing that I know that there's a number of really good people working on. And again, I don't have the specifics, but hopefully we'll be able to see it soon, and we'll be able to critically analyze whether it gets at some of the gender justice issues that we've been talking about here today. Because as we know, many of these issues around reproductive health and general human rights come from this ability to have some economic security in this country as well as others. That just is something that we're going to have to work on after this pandemic very, very fiercely.
Thank you, Latanya. Moving quickly on to some more questions while I have time, because we have a lot of questions coming in and a lot of great questions. So I hope we can get to most of them. Could you speak to the way the COVID response from the Biden administration has not fully addressed the gendered and racialized impact of the pandemic? Particularly, would love to hear about how we should be explicitly thinking about gender and race when evaluating policy responses to COVID from the government. Again, I'll open it to whoever would like to answer this question.
So I don't know if our the person that asked the question has seen the COVID group that was put together, and this was even before January. So I believe it was put together shortly after the election, but it does include a gender equity specialist. I know that Loris Pace from the Global Rights Council is on there. And so there are a number of folks that are on that committee who are actually thinking about how COVID has impacted, and I think we talked about this a little bit, but how it has impacted marginalized groups during the pandemic. And then they're also thinking about how we get at recovery and resilience. And this is something at Global Fund for Women that we really try to think about very hard. So it's not just about how do we respond to the marginalization and the further systemic atrocities under this pandemic, but it's also how do we make sure that these communities can recover and remain resilient throughout future pandemics and crises. And so that's a huge part of what I know we work with our groups around the world who have expressed to us some of the community concerns and the response from governments that they're facing as how to challenge this and make sure that they're not in a position like this again. And so I do believe that there has been a COVID task force that was put together to look at not just the public health implications, but also the gendered and racial implications of COVID-19.
And just to add a quick word on that, I think if we if we had a government response to the pandemic that understood the racialized and gendered impact, we would not be debating whether $1,400 or $2,000 was too much money for families who are months behind in rent because they have been out of work. For families that have been homeschooling while working, the impact on single mothers, right? We now have folks in Texas who have $13,000 heat bills, and we're begrudging people, $2,000 or less when that's not even a month's rent in many places. And so I just want to name, I think, the cash payment is one really clear example that if we were centering our COVID response on how this has impacted Black women, single moms, immigrant women, we would be talking about a lot bigger numbers and much more meaningful financial relief.
And I'll just add one other thing here, which is I think we have to talk about the impact, but we also need to talk about the root causes. So what is it that allowed particular populations to be in particularly vulnerable and marginalized situations as we faced a pandemic? We work a lot in conflict, and it's the exact same thing that we see, is that it's the existing inequality. So I'm hopeful that not only do our responses as we go through this pandemic address the impact, but that we actually spend some time reflecting on the root causes of what allowed this to happen in the first place and actually make a plan to address all of those factors. Because I think until we do that, we're just going to end up in cycles where whether it's a storm in Texas, whether it's a global health pandemic, whatever it is, we're going to see the same thing happen over and over again. And we're consistently going to be in a place of crisis response. And so I think we need to also be thinking about the larger structures and what like a preventative agenda on all of this looks like that tackles root and structural inequality.
Thank you so much for all of your answers. I am sorry to those questions we did not get to. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I really wish we could stay on and continue talking because this has been a wonderful discussion. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Akilah, Kimberly, and Latanya for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Please follow us at Newlines, INST, on Twitter to stay up to date for our events and to find out when our next webinars will take place. And on behalf of the New Lines Gender Policy Project, thank you so much, everyone, for joining the conversation today. Have a great week and stay safe, everyone.
You too, Emily.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care.
Bye. Thanks, Emily.
Bye.
Bye-bye.